Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest in Berlin is Dr. Leonard Schütte. He is a senior researcher at Munich Security Conference and one of the authors of a report on how prepared is the EU for the current military challenges. Welcome. So tell us, please, Dr. Schütte, is the EU prepared for the level of military challenges we are facing now?
In short, no, not at the moment. Since February 2022, the Europeans and the EU have made some significant progress in how they organize their joint defense. But they haven't come far enough, nowhere near far enough. So many EU member states have announced quite significant increases in the defense spending. There have been new EU initiatives to stimulate joint procurement and provide Ukraine with weapons. And certainly Europeans have converged in their threat perceptions. It is no longer in doubt that Russia and the eastern flank is the #1 priority. But there are ominous signs that some of those pledges, for example, will not be kept and that they simply don't go far enough.
If you address shortly the main challenges which the EU is facing, what are the main obstacles? What disturbs us? What makes us so weak?
I'll probably name three. So the first one is, how much money do the Europeans actually spend on defense? Now, this is an old hat. This is a long debate. Since February 2022, 20 EU member states have announced that they would increase their defense spending pledges. If those pledges were to be kept, that would amount to an extra spending of around 400 billion euros by 2028. Now, that sounds significant, and it is significant. But the calculations in our report show that actually, even if all those pledges were met, big if, the average EU defense spending by 2028 would still only be 1.8%. That is, as we all know, beneath the NATO minimum defense spending target that allies, yet again in Vilnius a couple of weeks ago at the summit, committed themselves to. So the first challenge is, how do we spend more on defense? The second is, what do we then spend it on? Because at the moment, there are diverging priorities among the Europeans. There's insufficient coordination, and that leads to duplications, to just very inefficient spending of the money. And the third question is of how then, once we've agreed on the priorities, how then do we spend the money? Do we spend them nationally? Do we spend the money on military goods off the shelf from outside of Europe, or do we develop and procure more together? And in the report, we make the clear argument that there needs to be much more joint European development and procurement of military goods.
As I was reading your report, what really shocked me, it wasn't a surprise, but when you see it on the graph, it's really shocking that the interoperability of the arms is very weak. Like, we have 3 up to 4 times for some types of weapons and 5 times more different types of weapons and arms compared to the US. Yeah. Is it something we can overcome, or is it the birth trauma of the EU armies?
Well, certainly there is a problem of path dependency. Once you're set on a certain path, it's very difficult to change it again. And may I add, this is not only a problem for European defense proper, but also because Europeans have exported this fragmentation to Ukraine. I mean, the Europeans have delivered 5 different main battle tanks alone to Ukraine, which of course comes with all sorts of interoperability questions, but also very difficult logistics and so on. So this is a big problem, both for Europe, but
so now if you're a technician in a Ukrainian tank division, you need, in the worst case scenario, you need to have spare parts for 4 or 5 different types of battle tanks.
Exactly, plus different supply chains and so on. So this is a massive problem for Ukrainians, but it is also a problem, of course, for the EU. Now, this can only be overcome in small steps. Nobody thinks that this is an overnight challenge, and I think the way to do it is to really address the structural roots of this fragmentation, and that is that there is not a single defense market, but actually, unlike in most other economic activities in the EU, there are 27 different markets, 27 different militaries, 27 different defense ministries that don't sufficiently coordinate. Until recently, there were insufficient EU incentives to actually do things together. Now that is starting to change. We have, since 2016, there were the first steps towards more joint development. Now, since February 2022, the EU has launched 3 different initiatives, or is thinking about 3 different initiatives to stimulate joint procurement. And so, things are moving, but I fear this is going to be a medium-term challenge at best.
You said at the beginning that money can be one of significant problems, like how much money we spend. But if I read correctly your report, you also asked a question in another direction. Can money solve all the problems? We don't have that much less money spent on our defense compared to the US, but our strength of our combined forces is much lower, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, more money is necessary, but it's nowhere near sufficient. We spend it extremely inefficiently. I think that is the bottom line. And indeed, that is the danger that many of the Europeans are facing at the moment. Now, we've increased, if we increase our defense spending pledges, but don't change the way we spend it, the risk is that it's just going to, be spent inefficiently. The funds will just peter out without actually making much of a practical difference. So it is, again, that's the point about the structural changes that the European Defence Corporation needs in order for the money actually to be spent efficiently, so that we don't buy different or the same goods but from different suppliers. Hence, the suppliers produce them in very small quantities, making them more expensive, causing military interoperability and so on. So indeed, money is the first step. But how we spend it is the next step that we need addressing.
And that is what I wanted to ask you a bit deeper. Like, could you elaborate what kind of spendings you already named? For example, the spending on expensive goods because they are being produced in smaller quantities. But what is the main problem of inefficiency of our money spendings? For what do we spend money? What we could easily put aside?
Well, I think the main battle tanks is a illustrative example. We have 5 different main battle tanks that are all meant to serve the same function, be a main battle tank. The US has 1. And this stark difference between how many different versions of essentially the same military good the Europeans have compared to the US is striking. That pertains to jets, it pertains to frigates, it pertains to all sorts of other military equipment. So that is what we need to overcome. We need to overcome that duplication, that fragmentation that goes hand in hand with it.
Well, the main battle tank is the holy cow of every land army. Like, you cannot say the French, okay, you don't produce your Leclerc, or you cannot say the Germans, you don't produce a Leopard. There was an attempt to create the common main battle tank platform for France and Germany, but it has utterly failed.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't go quite as far to say it has utterly failed, but it is not progressing with the speed that we certainly need. That is the main MCGS. There is, of course, the other main European initiative is FCAS, the attempt to provide the next jet to replace the F-35s and the Eurofighters and so on. But you're quite right. On these big projects, there is insufficient progress. And that has all sorts of causes. I mean, there are still very protectionist industrial reflexes in Paris and Berlin and elsewhere. It is inherently complex, of course, to bring various European member states together that have different industrial interests, but also different military cultures, that want different specification of what the respective military good is meant to provide, and so on. So it is a very complex project. In the past, often these projects have also suffered from simply a lack of political support, because often the way to overcome these conflicts at the working level or the industrial level is political leadership from the top that really drives these projects onward. And my hope now is that political leaders across the continent have realized that we are in a new era. We are, there was a Zeitenwende, as we like to say in this country, and with strong political support, my hope is that actually we can make some progress on these joint projects. But by no means am I pretending that this is an easy thing and we just need to change the switch. But rather, this is going to be an enduring problem, which needs a lot of attention.
the problem of a political character which cannot be repaired fast enough. That is what the EU is facing now, seen at the military challenges in Ukraine and military threats from Russia. Before we come further to our questions, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel, and stay with our interview. We have seen the problem with the ammunition in this war, and the Ukrainians are pretty angry on how much deficit they face on the ammunition supply. We have also seen that the American supply of cluster ammunition for Ukraine was also caused by the lack of normal ammunition. Did the EU face this problem in our own production? Could we achieve some goals here on this way to produce more ammunition we need?
Well, I hope so. I mean, the EU has certainly recognized the problem. In February this year, it launched the so-called ammunition initiative, which has the primary goal of providing Ukraine with 1 billion rounds of 155 artillery munition within a year. Now, this is extremely ambitious, and there are many out there who doubt that this is going to happen. But so the recognition of the problem is there. Now, the EU has proposed essentially a three-step plan to achieve that. The first is to subsidize member states who want to donate from existing stocks, and they have set aside €1 billion to support that. The second step is to support, again, European member states with another billion to jointly procure munition, so to increase both speed but also lower prices. And the third, and potentially the most interesting bit for the long-term support for Ukraine, is that it has just agreed on a new act to actually support the ramp up of production capacity, because ultimately that lies at the root of the problem. European defense industry simply lacked capacity to produce ammunition and also sorts of other military goods to the level that Ukraine requires. Now, the jury is still out. This is a very recent initiative, whether it's going to work. But it is quite an innovative approach, this three-step approach, and the hope is that it will come close, at least, to providing the 1 million rounds.
But that was one of the questions which was raised many times. Like, even if we have money, can we scale our production? Can we increase our production? We had the military factories inside of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc, like in Bulgaria, which produced immense amount of ammunition. But we didn't have anything compared to it in Western Europe, because we just didn't expect a large war in Europe. So can we really scale it up?
Well, that's a big question. We don't know yet. I mean, there are now, finally, member states are realizing that they need to provide more than just signals, but actually both subsidize and sign long-term contracts. Problem is, in many countries, those procurement processes are very slow. They, again, needed a lot of political leadership to actually make any progress. Now the EU has set money aside. So it is too early to say. I know this is deeply frustrating because the war's been going on for more than 500 days, and we are only now starting to properly address this fundamental problem. But as you rightly say, you know, Europeans since the 1990s didn't believe that it would ever have to fight a large-scale war of attrition again. And this insight has taken a long time to set in, even after February 2022.
Can we seriously speak about some strategic autonomy of the EU as long as we do not produce most weapons we may use one day in our home? If we look at the countries which remilitarize massively during the last months, like Poland, the biggest supplier of Poland is not Germany, not France, but South Korea and the US. Should we buy our weapons outside of the EU as long as we cannot produce them in our home?
I'm sympathetic to the argument because, of course, there is now urgency to rearm in Europe, but also to procure so that we can provide weapons to Ukraine. Now, in the report, we call this a procurement trilemma. Essentially, when faced with the need to procure new weapons, Europeans face three options. They can develop it nationally if they don't already have it in stock. That's the way to retain most control, to customize the equipment in the way they need. But of course, it's slow and it's costly. And if uncoordinated, it just exacerbates the fragmentation we have in Europe. The second option is the one you just referred to, is to buy off the shelf abroad. Now, I should say that buying off the shelf is a bit of a misnomer, because there's actually nothing off the shelf. It just means there are systems that exist, but they still need to be produced. So it's not that they'll be supplied overnight, but they'll be supplied quicker than if you were to develop them from scratch. And again, I'm sympathetic to the argument that that is certainly the quickest way, and given the urgency, that is perhaps the way forward. But of course, it carries medium-term risks, and that is that we deprive the European defence industry of all capacities and technological sort of edge it has, which in turn will render us more dependent on external suppliers in the medium to long term. The third option then is to develop and procure together as the European Union, or among European states, shall we say. That would lead to increased military interoperability. It would keep jobs in Europe. It would strengthen European defence industrial base. But of course, it takes longer, and it is very complex, as we see with the existing cooperation projects in Europe, and it comes with all sorts of political risks. So I guess member states and political leaders really need to walk a fine line of deciding which capabilities do we really, really need immediately, as quickly as possible, and purchase those off the shelf abroad when they exist, but not make the mistake of going down the road of only relying on off-the-shelf orders, because again, in the medium term, that would come back to bite us.
Yeah, and that was exactly that will make us dependent on the will if we want to re-export them or we want to use them the way that is not foreseen by the contract. It could be a problem for us. But if we come to this argument that we need to strengthen our defense industry, our economy, and even to preserve or to create more jobs, isn't it the argument which is not being used very gladly in Germany in particular? I haven't seen like any German politician who addressed the military industry and military production as a jobs motor.
Yeah, it's true, and I think that has two reasons. For one, that German political culture isn't very open towards thinking about military and arms industry as a strategic asset, but rather, as something that is morally dubious, and that is only very slowly changing. But the second is, say, unlike in France, German arms industry is private. The state has no direct impact on the companies, and so it has different levers than say, the French government.
What would, from your opinion, what should EU produce first, like as the first step to increase our defense capacities?
Well, I'm no military expert, so I'm on thin ice here. So I think your viewers, many of whom will have greater knowledge in that, will have to forgive me. I think with ammunition is a good first step, because it is, as a product, relatively simple. It is undoubtable that everyone needs more of it, and that we currently have, too many different versions of 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. I think that was my first, one of the biggest surprises I encountered when looking deep into this topic, that actually that is a misnomer as well, because there are so many different versions of the 155 munition that actually don't always operate with different systems. That was striking. So I think this is a good first priority. Now, others have mentioned that perhaps air defense missiles could be next, because again, we need more of it in Europe. Ukraine certainly needs more of it, doesn't have enough, and that might be an opportunity for such initiatives to address next. But again, I think that is perhaps for others to decide.
But coming back to this issue you mentioned, like boosting our economy, boosting our production, creating our capacities to produce. When we look at what kind of factories have been opened now by the German producers like Rheinmetall. Rheinmetall doesn't create a new factory in Germany or even in the EU. Rheinmetall is creating a new factory in Ukraine. And when we are talking about a maintenance factory for the German Leopard 2 tanks, which German companies should have opened in Poland, close to the Ukrainian border, it hasn't been opened. The plans have been cancelled to the latest stand. Is there a gap between our intentions and intentions of our political elites to increase our military economic capacities and the reality where we still are not moving or moving not fast enough?
Evidently there is. And I think there was for a long time a misunderstanding between political decision makers and the arms industry, because for political decision makers it was clear that their response, both discursive and material, to the onset of the war would mean that arms industry should essentially start producing, start building before actually seeing any contracts. Because they said, well, it's obviously going to happen. I think there was a misunderstanding of how the arms industry works. You know, there are shareholders who might object to taking on financial risks and so on. And I think it's been a very slow process of the two sides sort of approaching each other and understanding each other better. Again, my hope now is that with money starting to be spent and contracts starting to be signed, this will change. But again, it's taken too long.
We are now in the 15th month of war, and you say like it took us this 15 months to go further with understanding. Now it will take us like months, maybe a year, maybe more, to create these capacities and start to develop them. How long-term oriented should be this policy? Can we talk about the understanding of remilitarization of Europe policy, if I may use this word, or about like boosting our defensive capacities? Is it long-term policy?
My understanding is yes, that political leaders across the continents and in Brussels have realized that, you know, the current war is not a sort of a one-off phenomenon, but actually we have entered into a new era in international politics where the use of force may become a more prominent sort of instrument of statecraft, be that by Russia or other
It's not only about Russia.
It is not only about Russia, and even if it were to be about Russia, then it is clear that both Ukraine but also EU member states will need to up their deterrence also once the war ends, because, you know, we will not enter, we're not going to go back to the early 90s in the immediate aftermath of the war. So I think there is an understanding that this needs to be a long-term policy change, that we build long-term capacity again to rearm ourselves, yes.
But is this understanding arrived to broad circles of the population? Can the new electoral cycle just change it because the other politicians will be elected, because people will be tired of this war?
I think contrary to initial fears that a big sort of Ukraine war fatigue would set in, I think we've seen two things. For one, political discussions on sort of among the public has actually been quite serious and quite mature, and in many countries, including in this country, you know, the discussion has moved on very, very quickly and has shed old axioms, and now we're actually talking about the things that we need to talk about. And that is reflected in public opinion. Now, these public opinion polls are always a bit vague and we need to take them with a pinch of salt, but we cite some of them in the report, and that says something like almost 70% of surveyed people from the EU are in favor of more defense spending, 80% are in favor of more joint procurement. So at least on an abstract level, that is set in. So I think political leaders shouldn't hide behind the argument that the public is opposed. I don't see very strong signs that they're categorically opposed. And actually there is realm where political leadership can convince the publics that we need a change in policy. But of course, now we're at a time of rising inflation, rising costs of living, massive investment needs and other things. This is going to be, of course, a difficult political process, but one that political leaders simply have to take head on and make the case for why spending, defense spending, is a prerequisite for everything else.
Will the situation change somehow the approach of the EU countries for exporting of weapons? As we know that any company is dependent on the market. If we artificially close the market for exporting the weapons only to areas where there are no conflicts, and we had that ban to exporting weapons to conflict areas, we not only prevent the victim from the right for defense, as we have seen in the beginning of Russia-Ukrainian war, we also deprive the company from producing the goods, like from the pure economic perspective. Can we expect that the EU would ease the regulation of exporting arms, allowing arms to be exported to our partner countries which need weapons for protection?
Well, at the moment, this is still a national prerogative. The EU attempted to come up with a joint EU sort of policy on arms exports, but hasn't really managed to do so. And traditionally, there are sort of two camps in the EU. There's the one camp, which is probably led by Germany, that is highly restrictive in this arms export policy, and one that might be led by France, that is much more liberal in its arms export policy. And that, of course, that difference has often caused animosity, but also problem for joint projects where perhaps some of the participating states of the project wanted to export weapons to a country that others absolutely did not want to, and because they could wield a veto, they did. Now, there is some movement toward a more sort of harmonized approach. The German Defense Secretary, Boris Pistorius, mentioned that Germany wants to consider arms export policy more from a strategic perspective. But it has a long history of being fairly restrictive, and I think in many ways that is a good approach, but one, of course, needs to be very differentiated in the various countries and also military goods. There's not a one-size-fits-all policy that one only exports weapons to EU and NATO allies and to nobody else, or vice versa, that we become super unrestrictive. So I think this is a political process that will go on for some time.
That what you have described is the continuation of this Zeitenwende discussion in Germany. We wanted to present ourselves as leaders with our trade connections, but we have seen that trade does not solve every problem. We have seen it in regarding Russia. And now we say we want to lead also from the military perspective, like delivering weapons, helping other countries to protect themselves. But to do this, we need to have enough weapons on the market. We need to have enough weapons that can be delivered today. Is there an understanding in German political elites regarding what do we need to really lead, not to be dependent on the overseas suppliers like the US?
Well, I'm not sure Germany is necessarily going to be a leader on military affairs. I think it wants to be less of a laggard. I think that would be, for now, a more realistic ambition. But on the specific point of how Germany supports the European defense industrial base, actually, if you look at the main projects that the Sondervermögen, this 100 billion euro worth special fund is meant to be spent on, most of them, the big ones, are American. So F-35s, Chinook helicopters. Now for the European Sky Shield, this new air defense system, most of the equipment comes from either the US or from Israel. So for Germany, I think urgency has been the main driving force since the onset of the war, and that has meant purchasing from abroad. And as I said in my previous answer, to some extent that is understandable, and that's probably the right thing to do, especially if you're aware of how slow, in particular, the German procurement processes work. But that is no long-term strategy. If we do that, if we continue doing that, we render ourselves dependent. We deprive our own industry of the capacity to actually be a leader in the future. So I think this insight that the Zeitenwende has to be also Europeanized, not just transatlantic, is yet to trickle in.
Should we raise the discussion, should we go into discussion with easing our bureaucratic processes? We know how long time it takes for any new procurement being approved and how long time it takes to get the newly produced arms to the army. Can this be changed from the peacetime rules to wartime rules?
Well, that is what, in particular, the German Defense Secretary Pistorius wants and is announced to do. And I think there are several levers here that could be pulled. For one is that, and we come back to a previous point about needing more Europeanization. We just need common standards. That would already help massively. Rather than producing 20 different versions of, say, a helicopter, we want one or two. So we reduce sort of the demands for specification. And that is something that pertains, I think, to most European states.
But that means unprecedented integration in the EU. We have never had it on that level.
I'm not sure that necessitates that. You know, what we've seen in the past, there's a good example of a helicopter. I forget the specific name of it, but essentially there was one producer of that helicopter, and I think 19 member states or European states got together to acquire it. So there was not necessarily integration, but there was just joint procurement. But 19 member states wanted 19 different versions of that helicopter. So all the potential economies of scale and speeds were lost in that process. And I think what is starting to change is that armies have realized, or at least defense secretaries and ministries have realized, that we might need to go for the 90% option and not always push it to 100%, to be more pragmatic and, you know, to take the second best, but one that is much cheaper and we can get much quicker. So that is what, you know, standardization. The other is, of course, internal bureaucratic processes, and here I won't bore your viewers with the German sort of bureaucratic ins and outs, but there are attempts to streamline procurement processes. There are attempts to delegate greater responsibility to the individuals within the respective bureaucracies to take decisions. I think we're yet to see this materializing, but there's hope that, you know, again, with political leadership, some progress can be made here.
Like, do we already see like some sort of discussion? We have this round of EU defense ministers discussion. Do we see the creation of new vehicles, of new platforms in the EU to foster this discussion, to make it more effective?
Well, I'll probably take a step back and say, first and foremost, you know, we also need better discussions, better cooperation between NATO and EU. The two organizations have a massive overlap in membership, even more so now that Finland has joined NATO and Sweden soon will. In the course of the war, they've realized that one cannot really do without the other. You know, NATO has that military perspective, but the EU has certain instruments that NATO doesn't have on sanctions and on incentivizing cooperation. So I think the premise of all of it is that those two organizations first better coordinate and better synchronize their activities. The EU has launched new instruments. EDIRPA is one, that's a 300 million worth instrument to stimulate joint procurement for urgently needed goods. It has the new ammunition initiative, that is innovative. There is an idea floating about of creating a long-term instrument to stimulate joint procurement and also ramp up arms production capacities. The European Peace Facility, a formerly quite opaque instrument, has been sort of reconceptualized to fund arms provisions to Ukraine, and now there's talk about significantly increasing it. So things are moving. Whether they're moving fast enough and whether there's sufficient funding, that's another question.
Regarding this development and your study, when you have seen the problems we're facing, you see the ways we're going to solve them, what is your perspective? How can we achieve a more stable situation in Europe and more effective defense and security policy?
I think the vision here is one where Europeans strengthen the European pillar in NATO and have a much better division of labor between the EU and NATO. And so what this means is that I think NATO is the organization that is, of course, principally tasked with collective defense. It is the organization, in our view, that should lead on setting the capability targets that Europeans need. Now, where the EU can come in is that it has the instruments to actually acquire those. So if those priorities are much better aligned, we can use the different instruments that the organizations have to a much better effect, and actually so that the cooperation becomes more than its parts. At the moment, we still see too much duplication, insufficient harmonization, insufficient coordination between the two organizations. But in Vilnius, in the communiqué, it says quite clearly that there is a need for more European, whole of Europe cooperation, and that of course entails coordination between the two organizations.
We need more coordination, we need more unified approach to our security needs and to our defense policy. This is the core idea of the report by Munich Security Conference regarding the situation with production of arms in Europe. And our guest today was Dr. Leonard Schütte, one of the authors of Munich Security Conference report. Don't forget to share, to like, to subscribe to our channel. Thank you for this interview, and we're waiting for the next interviews.
Thank you for having me.